for joining us today. You're in for a real treat. We always try to bring some great biblical teaching, and today is no different. Dr. Jeff Jones is going to come, and in the middle of a very difficult time, we're talking about the coronavirus, he's going to do some historical examination of quarantines and hand washing. And you know what? God had this really pegged centuries before we ever had this kind of a situation. We've always had great teaching at Ray of Hope, and certainly today you're going to hear some great teaching. So thank you for joining us today. Dr. Jeff, come and share today.
Glad to have you with us today. Welcome to the Ray of Hope teaching ministry. I think you're going to find this very inspiring, very interesting. So plan on sticking with us for about 30 minutes, and I think you'll be blessed. I don't have to tell you that we're living in a very strange time. Who would ever thought that Walmart would want less people to come? We have to be 6 feet apart, and they can't let more than so many people in the store at one time. Whoever thought that the toilet paper aisles would be empty? Whoever thought the restaurants would be closed and you could only order out? Who would have thought that we could get gasoline for $1.50 a gallon? So these are very strange times. And strange times bring us some anxiety, and they bring us some fear, because it's our human nature to want life to be predictable. So when life is not predictable, it does bring some anxiety and fear to our lives. Well, we're facing a threat, this coronavirus, and the reason it brings us anxiety and fear is because it's an unseen enemy. We like our enemies to be seen. That way we can know how to combat them, how to escape them, how to fight them. But this coronavirus is an invisible enemy, so it's hard to know how to escape. How do we know who has it? How do we know who's carrying it? How do we know who might give it to us? How do we know if we don't have it? Anyway, and so as a result, what we're doing to try to control this and flatten the curve, prevent ourselves from becoming infected, is doing the social distancing, the social isolation, quarantining some people, extra hand washing. We've always washed our hands some, but now we're washing our hands a lot. Wearing face masks. So being a family medicine and sleep medicine physician, I've always been interested in medical history. And so tonight, I thought it would be interesting if we would look at some of the medical and scientific history of these things, and even go back to ancient times, go back to scriptures, kind of bring all this together and let us kind of see how we got to where we are today with combating this pandemic, the coronavirus. So before we get into the actual history of quarantines and hand washing, I want us to look at the history of the germ theory of disease. Because, you know, today when they tell us to socially isolate, today when they tell us to hand wash more and more, we understand why, because we in America have been privileged to learn through going to school, through education, through science classes, why we need to do that. We all understand that there are an unseen microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, things we can't see that are on our hands that can make us sick, that we can be carrying, that we can transmit to other people through sneezing, through coughing, even through talking. And so we understand that, but if you look at the germ theory of disease in the history of the world, it's actually a relative newcomer in the history of the world. If you go back to the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, the predominant theory of disease was called miasma. Miasma. So the very best scientists, the smartest, most advanced scientists in the world for hundreds and hundreds of years believed that miasma was the cause of diseases that caused epidemics. So anytime you had a disease where a lot of people were sick in one location, they said this was due to miasma, which meant bad air. In other words, they defined miasma as a poisonous vapor given off by decomposing matter. So basically, if a lot of people were sick in one area with the same disease, it was because they were all breathing the same bad air. And so the theory of miasma as the cause of contagious disease did not include the fact that one person could give another person a disease through contagiousness. So what really changed the thinking in science was in the 1860s. And there were actually lots of scientists that contributed to this, but I want to bring out two that were probably the most prominent. You probably heard of the first one and the second one. The first one was Louis Pasteur. He was a French microbiologist and scientist who in the 1860s had the first great breakthroughs in the causes and prevention of contagious diseases. So his discoveries really laid the foundation for the germ theory of disease. Maybe you've looked on your milk jug lately and seen the word pasteurized. That's after Louis Pasteur. He's the one who, when he linked bacteria to human disease, he discovered the way to mildly heat up milk and mildly heat up food to pasteurize it. In other words, heated it up just enough not to harm the milk or harm the food, but to kill the bacteria and the bacteria spores that were within that food so that the food and the milk would last longer and not be contaminated. The second scientist that really contributed to the germ theory of disease was Dr. Joseph Lister. He was a British surgeon. So he had heard of the discoveries of Louis Pasteur, and so he incorporated those elements into his surgery. So he was the father of what we call antiseptic surgery or sterile surgery. So he started using a carbolic acid solution to sterilize the patient's skin before surgery. This had never been done. He used the carbolic acid solution to sterilize his instruments. He used the carbolic acid solution to sterilize his hands before he did surgery. Now, this is before rubber gloves. And so by doing this, he vastly decreased the amount of post-operative infection that his patients had. Post-operative infection was rampant at that time. And so carbolic acid is now what we call phenol. And so phenol is even used today for antisepsis. Dr. Lister in 1884 patented a solution with phenol for home use, for people to use on cuts and trauma on their skin to keep it antiseptic so it wouldn't get infected. Have you heard of Camphor Phenique? Remember that little green bottle that your parents or your grandparents had in the medicine cabinet, and every time you got a cut or a scratch, they put Camphor Phenique on it. I think there's some Camphor Phenique products even for sale today. And then in America, in 1879, an aspiring chemist or pharmacist in St. Louis decided to take the name of Joseph Lister and put that on the name of his first antiseptic mouthwash. And we can buy that today. It's called Listerine. Have you heard of that? Listerine. And so if you go buy Listerine products, in the mouthwash section, it says Original Listerine. And then there's other flavors available today because the original Listerine really doesn't taste very well, but it certainly works good. And so that was sort of the beginnings of the germ theory of disease, of contagious disease, Dr. Pasteur's work, Dr. Lister's work, and the work of many other scientists in the late 1800s. And then as microscopes got better and better, in the 1890s, viruses were first found under the microscope. They're much smaller than bacteria. And so by the late 1800s, as the 1900s came to be, the theory of miasma, bad air as the cause of contagious disease, was basically put away, and the germ theory of disease was accepted and has now been proven. Now, you and I are blessed to be living in an age where we understand about germ theory. We're told to wash our hands, we know why. We're told to socially isolate, and we know why. But not everyone in our world today really understands that. You know, there are many, many people that live in the world today that have not had the blessing and encouragement through science that we have. Many years ago, I was a medical missionary to the country of Nigeria. I worked with the Igbo tribal people, and they were wonderful, generous, kind people. but unfortunately, most of them had not ever been to school. And so they would come to our clinic and come to our hospital for medication, and they believed in our medication because they saw it work. We would give them antibiotics, we'd give them worm treatment, we'd give them malaria treatment, give them vaccinations. And they didn't understand the germ theory of disease, but they came because they trusted us. Now, we'd say, we're giving you this tetanus shot today, we're giving you this vaccination for measles today, and it's going to prevent you from being sick a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 3 years from now. Didn't make much sense to them because they had no clue about the germ theory of disease. But they still trusted us because they had seen it work. So I wanted to give you this historical background of the germ theory before we get into talking about quarantines and hand washing. Now, next what I want to do is look at the state of medical science 3,500 years ago. So that would have been about 1500 BC, 1500 years before Christ. At that point in time in the history of the world, Egypt was the dominant nation in the world. Egypt was the center of modern education. Egypt was the center of knowledge. They had the most up-to-date treatments for disease. And interestingly enough, we know what those were. An archaeologist named Dr. Ebers in the 1800s was doing archaeology in Egypt in the 1800s, and he came across some papyruses. And one papyrus that we now call Papyrus Ebers in his honor basically elucidated the treatment for 842 different human ailments, conditions, and injuries. So this papyrus listed for us the up-to-date scientific treatment 3,500 years ago, at that time at the greatest center of knowledge in the world, in Egypt. Now, let me read to you some of the remedies that were prescribed in the Papyrus Ebers. The remedies included lizard's blood, swine's teeth, putrid meat, stinking fat, ass's hooves ground up, animal urine and manure, flies, and even moisture from pig's ears. So this was the modern science and medicine in 3,500 BC. Now, why this is important? Because this is the same time the Israelites were in Egypt. They were held captive in Egypt for about 400 years. And as we know, towards the end of that captivity, Moses was born to Israelite parents, but his story in Exodus 2 tells us how he was raised in the royal court of Egypt. He was raised as a son of Pharaoh's daughter. The Apostle Paul in Acts 7:22 tells us Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. So we can only assume that Moses, in his schooling, learned from the Papyrus Ebers all of these treatments for diseases that the Egyptians were suffering. And then, of course, later, as we know from biblical history, that Moses led the Egyptians out of Egypt. It's called the Exodus, where we get our word exit from. And as they left Egypt at the waters of Marah in Exodus 15, God gives Moses and the Israelites a remarkable promise. Let me read this to you. Exodus 15, verse 26. If you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God and do that which is right in his eyes, give ear to the commandments, and keep all of his statutes, I will put none of these diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer. The Lord your healer is Jehovah Rapha. Jehovah Rapha. Now, we know now, you and I know, from germ theory of disease, that has now been proven, that all these cures and remedies that I just read off to you, and there were many more in that category, that the Egyptian scientists taught from the Papyrus Ebers, that these cures and remedies actually probably accomplished nothing in the true treatment of disease, and in some cases made people sicker, and maybe even in some cases people died from these cures and treatments. But see, God then tells the Israelites, I'm your healer. I will give you instructions that will keep you safe from the ravaging diseases that you witnessed while you were in captivity in Egypt. So God proceeded to give Moses instructions with a number of commandments that would tell the Egyptians how to stay healthy. Tell the Israelites how to stay healthy. It's interesting that Moses, who had been educated in Egypt in the Pharaoh's court, so I'm sure he learned all the cures of the papyrus ebers, that he had enough trust in God that when he recorded what God told him, he did not include one thing from the papyrus ebers in his writing. We have the papyrus ebers to reference. We have the Bible to reference. Moses was trained in this, but he listened to God and wrote what God told him. So before we look at some of the divine instructions given 3,500 years ago, we want to take a look at the most prevalent, deadly disease, not just during Bible times, but up until 200 or 300 years ago, that ravaged the world. It was the most feared disease in the history of the world until the last 200 or 300 years. And that was the disease called leprosy. It killed millions and millions of people over hundreds and thousands of years. In 1873, a few years after the work of Dr. Louis Pasteur, Dr. Hansen of Norway identified the bacteria that caused leprosy. In his honor, this is also called Hansen's disease. Now we currently have antibiotic treatment for leprosy. In the United States, there used to be many leper colonies because this was recognized as an infectious disease that could be transmitted. It was actually transmitted in droplets of the breath. So it's called droplet transmission. In America today, there was one leper colony in continental United States that is now closed. The last one was in Louisiana. It closed in 2015. We still have one leper colony today that's in Hawaii. But worldwide, there's still over 200,000 cases of leprosy reported every year as of 2018 per the World Health Organization. Now, what I'm going to read to you now is from the writings of Dr. George Rosen. Dr. George Rosen was a professor of public health at Columbia University in New York, which is one of the renowned medical centers in the United States. About 50 or 60 years ago, he wrote a book called The History of Public Health, and he's going to tell us how serious this leprosy was. Leprosy cast the greatest blight that threw its shadow over the daily life of medieval humanity. Fear of all other diseases taken together can hardly be compared to the terror spread by leprosy. Not even the Black Death in the 14th century or the appearance of syphilis toward the end of the 15th century produced a similar stage of fright. Early in the Middle Ages, during the 6th and 7th centuries, it began to spread more widely in Europe from the Mediterranean area and became a serious social and health problem. It was endemic, particularly among the poor, and reached a terrifying peak in the 13th and 14th centuries. So we have to ask ourselves, what started bringing it under control in the late Middle Ages? Now remember, this is hundreds of years before science discovered the germ theory of disease. So Dr. Rosen continues in his book. In the later Middle Ages, leadership was taken by the church, as the physicians and scientists of the day had nothing to offer that was effective. The church took as its guiding principles the concept of contagion as embodied in the Old Testament. This idea and its practical consequences are defined with great clarity in the book of Leviticus. Once the condition of leprosy had been established, the patient was to be segregated and excluded from the community. The church created leper colonies in the Middle Ages. Following the precepts laid down in Leviticus, the church undertook the task of combating leprosy. It accomplished the feat, greatly limiting the disease. So Dr. Rosen refers in his book about what was done in Leviticus. So now Leviticus, if you're familiar with the Old Testament, is one of the books of Moses. It was written approximately about events that happened 3,500 years ago. And it's a book of laws and guidelines that God gave his people through Moses to guide how they lived. So let's read from Leviticus 13:45 to 46 and see how they were to help control leprosy. The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. So Leviticus was written about 50 years after the papyrus Ebers. So when the best scientists of the day had their remedies in the papyrus Ebers, God tells the Israelites, if you have leprosy, this is what you must do. Number one, you must live away from the village. You must separate from your family. What do we call that today? Quarantine. Number two, if you have to go into the village or you have to walk on the road where other people might be, you have to dress in such a way that you can be identified as a leprous person. That way people will stand away from you. What do we call that? Social distancing. You are to cover your mouth and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." And so why would we do that? Well, leprosy, we know, is spread through droplet transmission, through speaking, through coughing, through laughing. And so God tells the Israelites, cover your mouth so that when you cry out in a loud voice, "Unclean, unclean," you're not spreading the droplets to other people. So what does that sound like? That sounds like exactly what we're doing today. You go to Walmart and what do you see? There's lines on the floor how far you can stay from from other people. Social distancing. You see people with masks on. Why? Because they want to protect themselves and protect others from the spread of the disease. We hear of people that have been diagnosed with COVID, and so they are quarantined, or people who've been exposed in an area that's been high in COVID, and so they come home and they have to be quarantined for 14 days. So all of these things we learn from Leviticus. So this is God's prescription for prevention of contagious disease 3,500 years ago, when the best scientists of the day, all they had to offer was lizard's blood, pig's teeth, animal urine, and animal stool. So that's a quick history of social isolation and quarantine. Let's talk for a few minutes about hand washing. You know, all of us know to wash our hands, but now that we have this COVID virus, we're washing our hands much more often, and we're trying not to touch each other and not to touch our face. So the recent history of hand washing starts about in the 1840s. The hero, the father of hand washing, is from Austria, and his name was Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis. Now remember, this is about 20 years before the work of Louis Pasteur. And so when Dr. Semmelweis came on the scene in 1840s in Austria, the main thought was still it was bad air. It was bad air that caused disease. So let me read again from this history book, medical history book. Vienna was famous as a medical center. Its most famous teaching hospital was called Allgemeine Krankenhaus. In the maternity wards of that celebrated hospital, 1 out of every 6 women who came to give childbirth died. The obstetricians described the deaths to constipation, delayed lactation, fear, and poisonous air. That's the miasma theory of disease that we talked about. So the protocol they had, when a woman died, they were wheeled into the autopsy room. The first order each morning was the entrance of the physicians and the medical students into the morgue to perform autopsies on the unfortunate victims who had died during the preceding 24 hours. You see, back then they didn't have refrigeration, they didn't have embalming, and so, when I was in medical school, myself and 5 classmates had one cadaver that we did our dissection on for a period of 6 weeks. Well, that cadaver was embalmed. Back then, 160 years ago, 180 years ago, there was no embalming, there was no refrigeration, and so they had to do their anatomy lessons on the people who died the last 24 hours before they started decomposing. So each day they had a fresh set of bodies because 1 in 6 women who came to give birth died. So after they had finished their anatomy lessons on the corpses, without cleaning their hands, the doctors and the students would march down to the maternity wards to do the pelvic examinations on the ladies who were in labor. Of course, no rubber gloves were worn because they were not invented for 50 more years. They were invented in 1894 by Dr. William Halstead of Johns Hopkins. In the early 1840s, in Vienna, a young doctor, Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis, was given charge over one of the obstetrical wards in this famous teaching hospital. He observed that the women that were dying were the ones who were examined by the attending physicians and the medical students who had come from the autopsy room, of the women who had died the night before. Whereas the obstetrical patients who were tended by the midwives, who were not part of the autopsy and the anatomy classes, not nearly as many of them died after childbirth. So he established a rule. He knew this infection and dying had something to do with clean hands. So he established a rule that in his ward, before you examined a patient, you had to wash your hands. So in April 1847, before he put this rule into effect, 1 out of 6 women died. That was 57 women died after giving birth in his ward. He put the rule into effect. 2 months later, instead of 1 out of 6, it was 1 out of every 42 that gave birth died. The next month it got even better. Only 1 out of 84 died. So the statistics strongly indicated that the fatal infections had been carried from the corpses of the women who died of uterine infection to the living patients. Now let me ask you a question. Was he praised by his superiors for this fantastic decrease in death? Sadly, what happened to him was what happens now when people come up with a change that's helpful. The response to his superiors was, "We've never done it that way before." He was ridiculed, he was scorned, he was belittled, his contract was not renewed, he could not get a job at any hospital in Vienna because of his reputation, because he was upsetting the apple cart, he was changing the way that things had always been done. We've never done it that way before. He looked around for a job. He finally found a job in Budapest, Hungary, in a hospital, and the exact same series of events happened to him again. The same response. We've never done it that way before. His contract was not renewed, and he was let go. Both hospitals went back to doing it the way they'd done it before. The death rate went right back up. Isn't that sad? Anyway, so at that point, he wrote a book called The Cause and Prevention of Childbed Fever. He documented his work very carefully, but the scientific and medical community did not respond to his work. They again said, we've never done it that way before. Unfortunately, he died in a mental institution in 1865 at the young age of 47. 1865 is about the same year when Louis Pasteur began his experiments, which showed and proved everything Dr. Semmelweis did was absolutely correct. So Dr. Semmelweis is called the father of hand washing. Now, he was not the first in history to advise hand washing to prevent contagious disease. Let's look at the Word of God. Leviticus 15. All through Leviticus, there's many examples where God gives instructions on hand washing to prevent disease. I just want to show you one. Leviticus 15, verse 11. Anyone the man with an infectious discharge touches without rinsing his hands with water must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean until evening. If you look at the entire chapter of Numbers 19, God instructs the Israelites to wash very thoroughly with clean water after touching dead people or dead animals. Why? Because many people that died, many animals that died back then was because of infections. They didn't have antibiotics. Now, even in America, if you go back 100 years before the advent of antibiotics, you see penicillin and sulfa came into commercial use in the United States in the late 1930s and early 1940s. If you go back to 1930 and look at the top 10 causes of death in America, number one in 1930 was pneumonia. Now that we have antibiotics that we can cure most cases of pneumonia and most infections, if you look at the causes of death today, pneumonia is now number 8. Everything above it is a non-infectious disease. I read this week in the news that even in Thailand with this COVID-19, this coronavirus, that the first medical worker in Thailand to die of the coronavirus, they identified his contact, where he got it. He had handled a person that died of coronavirus, but failed to wash his hands afterwards, so he himself contacted it. Because as you have heard, we all touch our face several times an hour. And so God's instruction in Numbers 19 not to touch dead bodies without washing your hands afterwards was very appropriate and certainly very true. So as we come to the close of this lesson, here's my point. Here's the main point I want to make. That God instructed the Israelites on social distancing, on social isolation, wearing masks, covering their mouth when they talked, hand washing to prevent the spread of disease, thousands and thousands of years before man understood why he said to do that. So what conclusions can we make? Number one, God is all-knowing. The word is omniscient. Man is very, very slowly through the years making discoveries about the mysteries of the universe that God created. But God knows all of these mysteries already. Why? Because He created all things. Second conclusion is that God cares about you and me. God cares about you and me. He gives us instruction in His Word about how life is best to be lived, how to act, how to think, what to do, what things to avoid, and not just about our physical health, but our emotional health and our spiritual health. The third conclusion is that just like the Israelites didn't understand the why of His infection prevention guidelines that He gave in Leviticus and Numbers, but still they did it and had good results, today we don't always understand the why of God's instructions to us. But just like the Israelites, life was better for them if they followed God's instructions, even when they didn't understand why. We too, life will be better for us now and in the future if we follow what God tells us to do, even if we don't understand why. So in closing, I'd like to say that I am so thankful for modern science. I practice it every day in my clinic. But let me tell you something. My hope is in the Lord. My faith is in the Lord. And my trust is in the Lord. Just like that old TV show, Father knows best. The Father knows best. So thank you for listening tonight. I hope it's been interesting. I hope it's been beneficial. I hope it's been inspiring. We invite you back to Ray of Hope, either live or online. And I wish you God bless and stay healthy. Thank you very much.